You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna with today's discussion on squatting. Squatting in a residential building is now a criminal offence in England and Wales. The government estimates there are 20,000 squatters in the UK, but squatting groups say the real total is far higher. The new law means squatters would face a jail sentence or a fine. Until now, squatting has been a civil matter, and homeowners had to go to court to prove the squatters have trespassed before they can be evicted. The British government say the new law will offer better protection for homeowners, but campaigners warn the legislation will criminalise vulnerable people and increase the numbers of people sleeping rough. Joining me for today's discussion on squatting is Tatiana Svetlova, a lawyer and partner at Svetlova LLP. David Cox is Senior Policy Officer at the National Landlords Association. Catherine Brogan is from Squatters Action for Secure Homes. And Sheila Stocking is a former squatter. Sheila Stocking, you're a former squatter. Why did you feel like you needed to squat?
Because I couldn't afford the rents in London. I was working part-time for Women's Aid, and I was doing a lot of voluntary work, so I just didn't have the money to afford to rent a private place, and there's no way I could buy somewhere.
David Cox from the National Landlords Association. You just heard from Sheila saying that she couldn't afford to get anywhere. She had to squat, but how much of a problem is it for your members?
It's mainly property owners that leave them empty, people such as those in Mayfair, the hedge funds that buy them for very large sums of money and just leave them empty as an investment. Otherwise, probate is a big one. It's actually probably the second biggest reason properties are empty. That somebody dies, they either don't know who the next owner is, or there is some sort of contentious issue with the will itself, and that can take several years to resolve, at which point the property has to stand empty.
Why shouldn't squatters take advantage of empty homes? They're going to be homeless. Why not let them take advantage of these empty homes?
We certainly want to see empty homes taken and brought back into use. We don't think squatting is the right answer to this problem. What we want to see is local authorities using their powers that they have at the moment to bring properties back into use. Things like private sector leasing schemes, which is where either the property owner doesn't want to be a landlord or doesn't know how to be a landlord. They can actually give the property to the local authority, to a housing association, for a period of years, usually between 3 and 5. They bring the property back up to the decent home standard and let it to the sort of vulnerable and low-income households on the local authority's housing waiting list. Now, that not only brings properties back into use, but it also provides a much-needed source. These are sort of people that will be languishing in B&B accommodation, possibly temporary accommodation. We want to see empty properties brought back into use for those sort of people, those sort of families, rather than having them squatted in.
Tatiana,
can I just say something here?
Sure.
When I was squatting, the main houses that were being squatted were empty council houses. They'd been emptied of the tenants because the council was going to pull them down and build new ones, but then nothing was done for a very long time. The people that I squatted with actually saved many of these houses, and they have now been turned into housing association accommodation and are accommodating people. If we hadn't squatted them, those houses would have deteriorated and wouldn't be in use now.
Tatiana Svetlova, lawyer and partner at Svetlova LLP. You've heard just now how valuable squatting is to keep homeless people off the streets, to give them shelter, and how squatters sometimes look after the homes that they're squatting in, which otherwise would go to ruin.
I think we need to look at the balance here, because when you say there are squatters who look after homes, we've just had a chat with Catherine, who said there are probably about 20,000 squatters in the streets. Well, that's not a great amount if you look, in perspective in the UK. But I'd like to go back to your argument where you said, well, look, there are whatever amount of properties empty in the streets. Why not let them be used by squatters? This is utopia, because we can go back and look at this argument. There are X amount of billionaires in the streets or all over the world. They have, bags of money which are not being used. Why don't we just employ a hacker, hack their bank accounts, and, let the squatters, unemployed, everybody else use that money?
I'm sure it's not going to be as anarchic as that. We're saying that empty properties can help homeless people, though.
But Daniel, you have to understand that the law protects both spectrum of people. It protects homeowners and it protects squatters. And I emphasize greatly, if homeless people and people in the streets, there must be a solution. But the solution is not to take away from somebody who potentially suffers greatly. That there are people who are involved in legal battles, pay £20,000, £30,000 to get people out. As a result, they default on mortgages, they lose their property, they are in a very difficult position.
Now they don't have to worry about that, though. The new law means that they don't have to pick up the bill.
But I'm not saying that we should just abandon those people and criminalise them. For example, imposing a £5,000 fine is just ludicrous because it doesn't get you anywhere. Squatters don't have money, that's why they're squatting.
Let's bring in Catherine Brogan. You're from Squatters Action for Secure Homes. You've just heard from Tatiana. No way should anyone have access to these empty homes. How is that going to affect the people that come to you?
Well, there's some technical points there. I mean, I wouldn't say if it should cost anywhere between 20 and 30,000 to get squatters out of your property. It costs about £350 to get an interim possession order, which is what you need to make it a criminal offence for the squatters to stay in your property.
Homeowners shouldn't be forced
Homeowners
to have to push someone out of their home.
It's already illegal to squat in somebody's home. And I think this is the problem, that we need to draw the distinction between homeowners, property owners, and owners of derelict buildings. Not just people, who've left it empty. I'm not talking about it's the summer and you've got a student house and it's empty for a couple of months or whatever between lets. That's not a legitimate place to squat. What I'm talking about is derelict, abandoned buildings with metal grills on the windows, the water shut off on the street, fuse boxes ripped out, buildings that are not anybody's home.
Tatiana Svetlova, lawyer and partner at Svetlova LLP.
I will show you how it very quickly becomes 30,000. We had a client who bought a pub. They left it for about 2 months because they needed to get planning permission, etc. In the meantime, squatters have moved in. All the water supply was cut off. They opened it, the water started leaking very quickly. They were scared, abandoned the property. A week later, we're receiving a claim from Thames Water, £30,000. We went to court. Our clients have lost. They said we had squatters at the property. They couldn't do anything about it. They were the legal proprietors.
Let's bring in Sheila Stocking. You've just heard from Tatiana how serious some squatters can cause problems for owners of other buildings and causing problems for the owners.
I think this is very rare, actually. People take over buildings and squat in places because they want to live in them. And the vast majority of cases, they make improvements to the property and they maintain it. Properties that are left empty very, very quickly deteriorate. I think that obviously there are some people that, it's very unfortunate that these people were in this position, and this obviously shouldn't happen. But I don't think that criminalising all squatters is the solution to this.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna with today's discussion on squatting. Joining me in the studio is Tatiana Svetlova, a lawyer and partner at Svetlova LLP. David Cox is Senior Policy Officer at the National Landlords Association. Catherine Brogan is from Squatters Action for Secure Homes. And Sheila Stocking is a former squatter. David Cox from the National Landlords Association.
One of the key issues with this new piece of legislation, we don't think it's actually going to have any sort of impact at all on squatting, because as you're right, it becomes a criminal offence as soon as the IPO is served. However, the landlord, the property owner can't, as soon as you are removed by the police, squatters are removed by the police, the landlord can't go back in there, tidy it up and re-let it immediately. He still has to go back to court, get a civil order for possession from the county court before he can do anything with it, before he can live in it himself, before he can renovate it, before he can put tenants in. And that can take another 6 to 8 weeks, which means whilst the squatter has been removed at 3-4 weeks, you don't get lawful vacant possession of the property back for another 6 or 8 weeks.
It's usually a month, the next possession order hearing.
But what we're hearing from David is that landlords and owners of buildings are going to be adversely affected. Although squatters have been removed, homeowners are left vulnerable almost.
Well, see, this was our main concern with criminalising squatting altogether. And we, during the consultation period in the summer of last year, said to the Ministry of Justice, we don't think it's a good idea. We would like to see something like an exclusion notice that you have in the high streets on a Friday night where somebody has got drunk, is causing some sort of issue. Police can go, leave, don't come within 250 metres of this establishment for the next 24 hours. That is what we wanted to see with squatters.
The trouble with that is police already have a lot of paperwork. They have to deal with extreme crimes. They can't be standing around properties.
Well, that's exactly the problem with the new offence. And it's become criminal to squat in residential property. But it now falls all down onto the head of a police officer to decide whether or not that person is a legitimate squatter. Police, they require, I'm sure Tatiana will be able to explain it in much better detail, but reasonable suspicion that somebody is squatting. It now falls entirely onto the head of a police officer to decide whether that person is squatting. And we're worried that this offence could actually make the whole process so much longer, because criminal cases take precedent over civil cases. So if a squatter is being taken through the magistrate's court for this new criminal offence, what is happening to the property during that time? Can the property owner move straight back in? We're not sure. We've asked the government for clarification and they haven't actually answered the question.
Mm-hmm. Maybe Tatiana could shed a bit more light on this then.
I think we'll find out very quickly because we've had our first arrest, I think, in Brighton yesterday or today even. So I think we'll quickly see how this is going to work. But I think the main point for the government now is to actually deal with the problem, because the minute you have the arrested person, you will have to somehow deal with housing accommodation. You can't just impose a fine, imprison them. That could potentially be the solution, which is, of course, ludicrous. It can't be. But I think the government will have to act very quickly and come up with a solution.
Catherine Brogan from Squatter Action for Secure Homes.
The problem with this legislation, it was brought in with consultation over the summer, which the government says themselves that they shouldn't do. 96% of respondents said we don't need to change the law, including lawyers and police, as you've just heard. And only two victims of squatting, actually bothered to fill in the consultation form. So I think that shows how this isn't exactly a widespread problem that's affecting people in the way that the right-wing media is blowing it out of proportion.
We've heard from squatters groups now that the law's been brought in, there's going to be a rise in more homeless people. Is that a fear that you share?
Yes, I do. I think that the changes in housing benefits and I think the extortionate amount of rents in London, I think that even if you're employed, the minimum wage does not cover the amount that you'd have to pay in rent. I think that there is going to be an increase in homelessness. I think it's such a shame because organisations and people have worked so hard in London over the last 20 or 30 years to sort out the housing problem, and I really felt it was getting somewhere. And I think in the last few years everything is just going backwards, and that we're going to be back where we were in the 60s and early 70s when there's going to be huge homelessness problems. I think that in the rare cases where squatters do squat a place that is being used genuinely and is not derelict, why not use mediation? Why not use some of the squatters' organisations to go in, talk to the people, say, look, you can't really squat here, this is someone else's home, come, we'll help you find somewhere else. Why make criminals of people just because they need a place to live?
Tatiana Svetlova, lawyer and partner at Svetlova LLP. Why make criminals of people?
Sheila, I think I'll probably go back a little bit and say there are at the moment 1 billion squatters all over the world. So UK is not bad. I think we will be living in utopia if we say that something needs to be done, that there are no homeless people in the streets. It simply is not going to happen. We had that problem in the 13th century, 15th, 16th, etc. I think what would need to happen next is that there should be an organisation who would go out, look at the properties which are left empty. For example, if there are 10 buildings which are destined to be empty for the next 10 years, then that organisation needs to make some sort of proper action. They would have to enter into a contract, organise squatters. 20,000 squatters is not a great amount, I would repeat, for the UK, but there isn't anybody dealing with this problem. So the onus is now not just back on the government, back on charities and squatters themselves, because we're sitting and talking to Catherine, who's very capable, and I'm sure there are loads of young squatters out there who I came to the UK when I was 17 with absolutely nothing, got myself jobs all over the place, had no problems finding a job. There is also a problem, a mental health problem, and I'm not sure how many homeless people actually do have a mental problem, but I think the NHS and the health officials probably have to be involved much earlier than when the people start squatting. When people leave home at the age of 13 and 12, that's not normal.
Sure. If we go to a step before what you said we should set up an organisation to rehome squatters. But a step before that is what Sheila brought up, was mediation, trying to get existing squatters out of buildings and say, look, we will provide you with shelter, we will provide you with enough. Do you think that a mediation group would be enough? Catherine Brogan from Squatter Action for Secure Homes.
So the police raided a squat the day before the royal wedding, and they said to the owner, here you go, have vacant possession of this property, please make sure that nobody comes in here. And the owner was like, why are you here? I don't want the police here, I want these squatters to be here, I've got an agreement with them. They're staying in the property, they're looking after it until the owner got planning permission, which is one of the big issues.
Isn't that quite a rare? It's great to hear that it works.
No, it's not rare at all.
Rare?
There's another one as well that I know of where the owner, they had like two groups of squatters who'd like trashed the place, and then some other people I know moved in and they negotiated with the landlord, the owner, and for them it was brilliant because it meant that they had people looking after their property, the squatters gave them their names, they had a proper peppercorn lease. And then whenever the property owner wanted the building back, they give it back. Another building, I know, they give the owner the passports so that they could have like a bond.
They might have gone in as squatters, but they became legitimate tenants.
Yeah, because they've done exactly what Tatiana's talking about, which is mediate with the owners to draw up a mutually beneficial licence so that there's security on both sides.
But they know that once they have entered into any sort of agreement, verbal, written, payment, cash payment, rent, if you were, isn't a necessity of it becoming a tenancy agreement under the Housing Act.
Isn't that the success of this mediation group?
We're not sure whether mediation is necessarily the best way. In some circumstances, it can work very well. In others, it just adds another process, another rung on the ladder that will end up taking longer for property owners to get possession of.
If the owner has any kind of conversation with the squatters, then that can be an implied licence, which makes it more difficult for them in court. But if we're able to see each other as people and deal with a bit of humanity and, like, no offence lawyers, but, you know, maybe kind of cut you guys out, then we would be able to actually see each other like as human beings and sort of be like, okay, right, I've got, 2 months here, you seem like nice people, we'll like draw something up and we don't have to like give somebody £250 an hour for having loads of letters behind their name.
But if we go with what Catherine was saying before, we've heard two successful stories. David Cox from the National Landlords Association. We've heard two successful stories where landlords were able to, or homeowners were able to negotiate with squatters. That's got to be a good thing. If we've seen two case studies where it works, why couldn't this be rolled out further?
We're seeing two case studies here. We've seen what we would think are much better examples of bringing empty homes back into use. This is effectively leaving a derelict property in the hands of squatters. What we want to see is empty homes that may be derelict, or at least falling into dereliction, brought back up to the decent home standard. Anybody that agrees, and the sort of case studies that we were talking about then, they become tenants, and the moment a tenancy is created, the property owner, who will effectively become a landlord at that point, even if they don't realise they've become a landlord, will start to be governed by all the legislation that affects private landlords. In particular, where you have got a derelict property, they have to comply with what is known as the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, which is 29 points going through the actual quality of the accommodation that they're providing. Now, if that property is in a state of dereliction, and maybe the property owner is waiting for planning permission to knock it down, build something else, or waiting for planning permission to extend as part of major renovation. If that person, the moment those squatters become tenants, the landlord is going to be required immediately to remedy any of the problems under the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, which could cost them thousands of pounds, when what they're actually doing is just waiting to gain planning permission to knock the property down.
So, Catherine, we've just heard that although these great case studies were brought up, that when these agreements are put together between the tenants and the owners of the building, this opens them up to more bureaucracy, more laws that they have to follow.
Well, I think this is the problem, that there is too much bureaucracy, and rather than having to wait on waiting lists and go through all this red tape, a lot of thing about squatting and housing yourself in that way is that it's very DIY. You're not looking for the state to give you a house. You're not looking for.
You've got to think of these other owners.
But I mean, those other things. You can become a licensee, and you can draw up a licensee agreement so that you're not a tenant, and then the landlord is not responsible, and say that you're willing to undertake repairs and live in a way that maybe somebody who was paying rent wouldn't be happy with, but you're happy to live in those conditions and improve that place as a licensee, and that's fine. You're not interested in some kind of scenario where everybody's got their own ensuite.
Sure, let's bring in Sheila Stocking here. You're a former squatter. Does the scenario brought up by Catherine Brogan from Squatter Action for Secure Homes sound like a one which will likely to be successful?
Yes, I think it's a great idea. My experience of squatting was very positive. We did up houses, we renovated them, we kept them so that they were able then to be taken over at a later date rather than demolished. And, there are amazing, beautiful properties in Brixton now that people kept and that would have been destroyed if there hadn't been squatting there. And the way people say squatters is they're describing some people that go into places and trash them. That's not at all true. The vast majority of squatters need a place to live. They don't want to trash the place. They want a decent place to live, and they make improvements. They stop the roofs leaking. They do all sorts of things to improve the property because they want to live in decent circumstances.
A reminder that you're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna with today's discussion on squatting. Joining me in the studio is Tatiana Svetlova, a lawyer and partner at Svetlova LLP. David Cox is Senior Policy Officer at the National Landlords Association. Catherine Brogan is from Squatters Action for Secure Homes. And Sheila Stocking is a former squatter. David Cox from the National Landlords Association.
I can see where you're coming from, and I can understand, certainly, Catherine, where you were saying if you're happy to put up with that, with the sort of conditions, and that you will do the DIY yourself. But once it becomes, whether it's a licensee or a tenant, the property owner becomes governed by the Housing Act 2004 and the Health and Safety Rating System. So whilst you might be happy, the landlord and property owner might be happy, environmental health and the council will not be happy. What we want to see, and it's actually going back to Sheila's point earlier about human rights, that the right to housing is a fundamental human right, but also a human right, as has been certainly in England since the Magna Carta, almost 800 years ago, the right that people can't take away somebody else's right to property. So if somebody owns a property, nobody else, squatter, the state, can take that over and usurp that property owner's rights. And that is a law going back 800 years. So what we want to see is the houses, these empty houses, brought back into use and brought up to a much better standard than just DIY and squatters, so that then you'll be able to move into them through the council's waiting list. And yes, it's bureaucracy, and I can understand why you might want to avoid that, but the processes are put in place so that people get good quality, affordable accommodation all over the country, from Brixton to Denbighshire. And we've seen some absolutely brilliant example. I use Denbighshire up in North Wales, actually, as a prime example. 2009, they had a target of bringing 15 empty homes into use through a private sector leasing scheme where the owners just gave the properties to the council for a period of years. In 2009, target of 15, they brought 223 back into use, which severely reduced the local authorities' waiting list and gave families the accommodation that they need and that they deserve. And that is tackling homelessness.
Tatiana Svetlova, lawyer and partner at Svetlova LLP. Do you welcome the case studies that we've heard from David? Do you think this could be rolled out across
absolutely.
the country?
I mean, what I think we should look at it in a practical way as well. There may be thousands of happy squatters and happy landlords, but there are thousands who are very unhappy about it. So we can't have the law which just deals with one side of society and say, that's fine, there are 20,000 of you, we need to look after you. What about the other 20,000 who are absolutely...
We are already protected with the existing law.
But Catherine, can I ask you a simple question?
Said in The Guardian.
Yeah. Can I ask you a simple question? How much do you need a year in order to rent a flat?
Well, you're looking at, say, the first 2 months deposit.
It can cost £10,000
for the deposit.
Right.
And then if you're talking about a room in a flat somewhere cheap, a room in a house, I'm not talking like a 1-bedroom flat, and you account bills, then it costs, what, $700 a month maybe? But
so all we need is, it's a lot of money, it's £240 million to house all those people.
But obviously not all houses are going to be as expensive as
but also 240 million. We look at charities all over the world, people less 100 million, and also there's government involved. So actually this is not a huge sum. We can't say that we can't deal with it. So we need to look at the root of the problem. And I think the moment we potentially house those people, it may be that they will find jobs, so there will be a lesser impact on taxation, etc.
We've got 1 million people unemployed. I mean, it's not the same London that you came to when you were 17. People are time rich and cash poor, and the government is cash poor as well. And we've estimated it's going to cost about 560 million to implement this law over the next 5 years. So we've got, and also the Magna Carta also enshrines the right to use land that has been left fallow and left abandoned by people. So I think that the thing about people who squat is that they're not looking for handouts, they're not costing the state any money, and there's already existing laws to protect homeowners who want to put the property back into use. And if owners don't want to put the property back into use, maybe they're in prison, maybe they're on the run, maybe the bank's repossessed it, then people can do that, and they can do that off their own back. And I think that's also something that's very important, is that we're not looking to be housed in a council house.
Which is a positive, absolutely. But
guys, we're coming up to the end of this discussion, so sorry to interrupt. If I can get a short answer from all of you about what you think should be the next step to try and solve the squatters' crisis, almost. We'll start with Catherine Brogan.
I think that we should be bringing, as a Camden judge said, squatting can be good for society, and the greater public good is served by bringing empty properties back into use, and I'd agree with that judge.
All right, David Cox from National Landlords Association.
We want to see empty properties brought back into use. That, we think, will solve the problem. 750,000 empty homes. Let's get those brought back into use, and we want to see the government forcing local authorities to create things like private sector leasing schemes, social letting agencies, so that we can bring those properties into use. And at 750,000, we're going to be able to house every single squatter. So hopefully, if we can get them into use, we will actually solve the problem, and we need to build more houses.
And Tatiana Svetlova?
I think we need a missing link organisation, which would be probably started by the government and then backed up by some charities and private organisations, because that amount of money is possible. But also, if you think, I think criminalising squatters is a bad idea, because just think about the cost in prisons and the just damage to the squatters' lives. So we need somebody in between to implement, this mediation, find empty homes, talk to squatters, maybe get them jobs, get them back into, the working market.
Finally, we'll go to Sheila Stocking.
I think, yes, all of those ideas sound great. Basically, people need homes to live in, and I think that it's very disingenuous of the government to talk about the big society, which is basically going back to the point that actually squatters are helping themselves by housing themselves. It's very, very difficult to get or keep a job if you don't have a place to live, and I think that the government is diverting attention from their terrible housing policies by blaming it on squatters, basically, and making a big deal out of this. They're going to spend a lot of money in courts and bureaucracy and so on because of this new law, when it could be put directly into housing, which is what people need.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time for today. Thank you to all of my guests. Joining me in the studio was Tatiana Svetlova, a lawyer and partner at Svetlova LLP. David Cox is a senior policy officer at the National Landlords Association. Catherine Brogan is from Squatters Action for Secure Homes. And Sheila Stocking is a former squatter.